John F. Kennedy International Airport was buzzing with the energy of hurried travelers, announcements blaring from loudspeakers and the constant sound of suitcases rolling across the shiny floor. At the private gate, a sleek jet from the luxury airline Skylux Airways awaited takeoff. The atmosphere of exclusivity was palpable. Elite passengers dressed in impeccable suits waited relaxed while sipping cocktails served in crystal glasses. Among them, Rachel Carter, the chief stewardess, meticulously reviewed the passenger list. At 35 years old, with her blonde hair perfectly tied back in an impeccable bun and an expression of firm authority, she was the personification of professionalism. Her ambition was clear: to be promoted to crew manager. To achieve this, every detail had to be under her control. As he scanned the list one last time, something caught his eye. His gaze stopped on a surname that was uncommon among the elite of Skylux: Williams. His eyebrows furrowed. His instincts told him there was a mistake. Without looking up, he turned to his assistant Lisa with a dry tone. "Double-check the names in first class. I think there was a mix-up." Lisa, a soft-spoken flight attendant with a friendly smile, calmly reviewed the list. "I don't see any mistake, Rachel. What's going on?" Rachel didn't respond. Her attention was diverted to the entrance of the departure lounge, where a well-dressed family was approaching. Jonathan Williams, a tall, elegant man with a confident demeanor. He wore a designer suit that accentuated his presence. Camille, his wife, radiated sophistication in a burgundy silk dress and a serene look. Next to them, their daughter Maya, 10-year-old boy, watched everything with curiosity while holding a small leather backpack. Rachel tensed. Something didn't fit. Her mind made an automatic assumption. They didn't belong in first class. With a sigh of resignation, she walked steadily toward them. "Excuse me," he said with a professional but unwarm smile. "May I see your boarding passes?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the request. However, he wordlessly pulled out his tickets and handed them to Rachel. She examined them meticulously, looking for any irregularities. But there was no mistake. Seats 1A, 1B, and 1C, first class. Lisa, watching the scene, frowned. Rachel had never before inspected tickets with such insistence. Rachel, still suspicious, nodded stiffly and handed back the tickets. "Welcome aboard," he said with mechanical courtesy before walking away. As the Williamses settled into their seats, Jonathan exchanged a glance with Camille. Nothing needed to be said. They knew exactly what had just happened. At the back of the cabin, a middle-aged man with slick-back hair and an arrogant air watched the scene with a barely concealed smile. Edward Simmons, a financial magnate, settled into his seat with the satisfaction of someone sitting on top of the world. Rachel walked back to Lisa and spoke to her in a whisper. "Stay alert. If anything seems out of place, let me know immediately." Lisa frowned but didn't respond. She knew exactly what Rachel was implying, and she didn't like it at all. Meanwhile, Camille stroked Maya's hair and whispered in her ear, "Remember, honey, class isn't defined by money, it's defined by education and respect." Maya nodded slowly. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she felt that something wasn't right. The plane was about to take off. What Rachel didn't know was that her prejudice was leading her down a path of no return. The plane began to taxi down the runway as passengers settled into their premium leather seats. The dim lighting and scent of fresh champagne created an atmosphere of absolute exclusivity. Rachel walked around the cabin, adjusting small details. A napkin that was misplaced, a glass that wasn't in the right position. Everything had to be perfect. She still felt a slight discomfort in her chest. She couldn't get the Williams family out of her head. Something didn't fit. It wasn't a personal matter, she told herself. She was just making sure everything was in order. He approached Lisa and whispered in a low tone, "I want you to keep an eye on the Williams family." Lisa looked at her in surprise. "Why? They haven't done anything." Rachel hardened her gaze. "It's not a question of whether they've done anything. I just want to make sure everything goes smoothly. They can't cause any problems on a Skylux flight." Lisa sighed but didn't argue. She knew Rachel wouldn't change her mind easily. Meanwhile, in row 1, Jonathan and Camille exchanged glances. They were not oblivious to what was happening. They felt the eyes on them, the subtle tension in the air. It was not the first time they had experienced such silent judgment. But his patience had limits. As Rachel walked past them, Camille looked up and smiled politely. Uh, excuse me, miss. Is there a problem? Rachel paused. Her expression remained neutral, though her tone betrayed impatience. Not at all, ma'am. I'm just making sure all the passengers are comfortable. Camille held his gaze a second longer than necessary before nodding. How professional of you, he said in a calm voice. Rachel didn't know if that was a compliment or a warning. She decided not to think about it too much and continued on her way. Lisa leaned slightly towards Camille. If you need anything, please let me know, he said in a more friendly tone. Camille thanked him with a slight smile. As the crew began serving drinks, Rachel took it upon herself to oversee every move. She was so absorbed in her role of absolute control that she inadvertently deliberately omitted serving champagne to the Williamses. It was not a mistake. It was an unconscious decision, backed by his latent prejudice. Camille noticed the omission, but decided to wait. Minutes later, when she saw that everyone around her had a glass in their hand, she raised an eyebrow and raised her voice elegantly. Excuse me, miss, he called to Rachel. Rachel turned around, feigning surprise. Yeah? Looks like they forgot to offer us drinks. Rachel pursed her lips, as if she had only just realized her mistake. She forced a smile and nodded. Oh, my apologies. I'll go get them right away. She quickly walked away, feeling a pang of discomfort. Why was Camille making her feel this way? As if he knew exactly what was happening, as if he was waiting for Rachel to give herself away. As Rachel headed to the service area, a condescending male voice broke the silence of the cabin. Anyone can buy a first-class ticket these days, said Edward Simmons in a casual tone, but with the clear intention that everyone should hear him. Jonathan slowly turned his head towards him. Simmons took a sip of his champagne with a casual gesture. He smiled as if he had made a simple, unimportant comment. Camille sat back in her seat and crossed her legs with dagger-sharp elegance. I guess that's true, especially when one can buy the entire airline if you wish, she replied softly. Simmons was silent. Jonathan, still calm, gave him a long look before turning his attention back to his wife. But it was not Maya who was showing calm. The girl pursed her lips, lowering her gaze. At her young age, she already understood the weight of whispers and glances. Jonathan exhaled slowly. He knew this situation could escalate, and if anything bothered him, it was that his daughter had to witness this kind of behavior. He made a decision. He rose from his seat with the same elegance with which he had entered the plane and walked toward the cockpit. Rachel, who was returning with the champagne glasses, saw him and frowned. Mr. Williams? She asked, trying to block his path. Can I help you? Jonathan looked at her firmly. Yes, I want to talk to the captain. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but something in Jonathan's posture stopped her. She couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. But he also didn't like the direction this was taking. She reluctantly stepped aside, watching as Jonathan strode purposefully across the cabin. Something told him this was about to get out of hand. Rachel watched with a sense of unease as Jonathan Williams disappeared behind the curtain that separated the main cabin from the pilot's area. Something inside her told her that the situation was getting out of hand. I couldn't allow it. She took a breath and turned to Camille and Maya, who were still in their seats. The little girl had rested her head on her mother's arm, not saying a word. Camille, on the other hand, maintained impeccable posture, her chin slightly raised and her eyes fixed on Rachel, as if waiting for her next move. Lisa walked past her at that moment, watching her from the corner of her eye. Rachel, are you sure all this is necessary? He whispered in a barely audible tone. Rachel pretended not to hear her and continued on her way to the service area. I needed to regain control. Minutes later, the drink service continued, and Rachel made sure to offer the champagne to the Williamses with a stiff smile. However, the awkwardness lingered in the cabin. Some passengers pretended not to notice the tension, while others could not look away from the silent conflict unfolding in first class. The atmosphere became even more tense when Edward Simmons, the arrogant businessman from the financial sector, decided to speak again. His tone was casual, but every word dripped with venom disguised as indifference. It must be nice to travel first class for once in your life, he commented, turning slightly toward Camille. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Camille did not react immediately. He just sat back in his seat and crossed his legs with impeccable calm. His silence felt louder than any answer. Maya, on the other hand, frowned and shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her small hand clung tightly to her mother's. Camille noticed the gesture and, with a whisper, reassured her. Jonathan returned at that moment, his expression impassive. He leaned slightly towards his wife and whispered something to her. Camille nodded, as if her husband's confirmation was all she needed to stand firm. Rachel watched them suspiciously. His instincts were screaming at him that something was about to happen. The next shock of tension came during meal service. As Rachel and Lisa delivered trays of gourmet dishes, Rachel, without even thinking, overlooked the Williams seats. Lisa, who was walking behind her, stopped dead. His expression showed a flash of disbelief. "Rachel, you forgot these," he said, picking up one of the trays. Rachel blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, right." Lisa looked at her for a second longer than necessary before taking the plates to the Williams family on her own. Jonathan and Camille noticed. Jonathan let out a slight sigh, but Camille leaned forward slightly, a smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Lisa," he said softly. Lisa felt a lump in her throat. She simply nodded before continuing with her work. Rachel, for her part, was beginning to realize that everything he did was being watched, not only for the Williams family, but for the rest of the passengers. I had no room for error. But instead of turning back, decided to strengthen his stance. The minutes passed. The tension in the cabin, it became thick, almost palpable. The flight still had several hours left, but Rachel felt like she was losing control too quickly. It was then that he noticed something that set off his internal alarm. Jonathan was typing something on his phone. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. Were you filing a formal complaint? Perhaps contacting someone at the airline? Uncertainty was gnawing at her. If Jonathan Williams made an official complaint, her future at Skylux could be in jeopardy. I couldn't let that happen. It was at that moment that he made an impulsive decision. He approached the family with his firmest stance and most professional tone. "Mr. Williams, Mrs. Williams," he said calmly, "I'm afraid I must double-check your reservation. There seems to be a problem with your seats." Camille looked up and his smile widened just a millimeter. "A problem?" he repeated in an innocent tone. "What kind of problem?" Rachel kept her expression neutral, but her heart was beating faster than normal. "I just need you to stay with me for a moment," he said. Jonathan looked at her in silence. For the first time since the flight began, her eyes reflected something other than patience. There was a clear warning in them. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. And then Camille spoke. "I'm afraid we can't do that," she said softly, sliding her hand over her husband's. "We've already paid for these seats, and we'll stay exactly where we are." The tension in the air was suffocating. Rachel knew she was about to cross a dangerous line, but he wasn't going to stop now. Not when she was so sure she was right. The silence in the cabin felt thick, charged with a pent-up electricity that seemed to envelop every corner of the first class. Rachel maintained her firm stance in front of the family. Williams, although inside he was beginning to feel a growing pressure in his chest. She wasn't used to being challenged. Camille looked at her with the same serenity as before, with a slight smile that seemed to hide a secret. Jonathan, on the other hand, had the expression of someone who had lost patience. Lisa, who had been silently observing the situation, felt her stomach tighten. "I knew this wouldn't end well." Rachel took a breath and continued with her plan. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams," she repeated, trying hard to sound professional. "I regret to inform you that there appears to be a problem with your reservation." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "What kind of problem?" Rachel crossed her arms behind her back, a practiced gesture of control. "We have detected an irregularity in the system. Your tickets may not be valid for these seats." Camille raised an eyebrow. "They are not valid? How is that possible if they have already been verified?" Rachel didn't respond immediately. "I needed an outlet." "I'm afraid the only way to resolve this is to escort us off the aircraft for further confirmation." The plane was already in the air. The excuse was ridiculous. Jonathan sighed and ran a hand over his jaw, clearly holding back his frustration. Are you asking us to abandon the plane in mid-flight? Some people around let out surprised murmurs. Simmons, the businessman who had made comments earlier, watched with obvious interest as if he was enjoying the spectacle. Rachel felt a slight tremor in her hand. No, he couldn't afford to hesitate. Not exactly, he replied quickly, but we may need to relocate you to a more suitable cabin when we land. The word appropriate fell like a bucket of ice water. Camille leaned an elbow on the armrest and looked at Rachel with a sharp smile. Let me see if I understand correctly, he said in a calm voice, but with unquestionable firmness. It is telling us that our seats, which we paid for, are no longer appropriate for us. Rachel felt her stomach drop. Something in Camille's tone made her hesitate. Jonathan snorted, pulled his phone out of his pocket, and calmly dialed a number. Who are you talking to? Rachel asked, feeling her grip on the situation begin to crumble. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. After a few seconds, he smiled. With the management of Skylux Airways. The air seemed to grow heavier in the cabin. Rachel felt the blood rush to her stomach. No, it couldn't be. Jonathan held out the phone in her direction. I think they want to talk to you. Rachel blinked, completely confused. Before I could do or say anything, the cockpit curtain was drawn back, and there appeared Captain Reynolds, a man with a stern look and imposing bearing. What's going on here? He asked in a serious voice. Rachel turned to him immediately, trying to regain her composure. Captain, there is a problem with these passengers' reservation. Reynolds frowned. Problem? What kind of problem? Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Camille stepped forward, her smile intact. It seems Miss Carter thinks our tickets are invalid. He has asked us to leave the aircraft. A murmur ran through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged awkward glances, while others watched with growing interest. Captain Reynolds studied the situation for a moment before turning to Rachel. Is that true? Rachel swallowed. Captain, I'm just following procedures. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. What procedure justifies expelling passengers with valid tickets? Rachel didn't respond. Her mind was desperately searching for a way out. It was then that Camille let out a light laugh and shook her head. This has been fascinating, he said, with a terrifying calm. But I think that's enough. He slowly turned to Rachel, and his next words changed everything. We don't need to go anywhere, because we are the owners of this airline. Silence. Absolute. Rachel felt like the world stopped. All around, passengers were in shock. Some seemed to hold their breath. Lisa's eyes widened. Edward Simmons visibly paled. Captain Reynolds stood still for a second before turning his gaze to Jonathan, who nodded calmly. That's true, he confirmed, slipping the phone back into his pocket. My wife and I are the major shareholders of Skylux Airways. Rachel felt a cold sweat run down her back. He had made the worst mistake of his life. Rachel felt the ground beneath her feet become unstable. The plane hadn't moved, but his world had. Camille's words still echoed in the air. We are the owners of this airline. Rachel blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. It couldn't be true. His eyes went to Captain Reynolds, searching for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding. But the captain only had a stern expression on his face. Jonathan Williams sat back in his seat with a calm, crossing one leg over the other as he watched Rachel's reaction. There was no arrogance in his expression, only certainty. Camille, for her part, took Maya's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze to reassure her. Unlike Rachel, she didn't seem surprised by the direction the situation had taken. The passengers, previously mere observers, were now fully attentive to the outcome of this scene. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others, like Edward Simmons, seemed to have lost their haughtiness completely. Lisa, standing at the side of the booth, pursed her lips, suppressing the urge to intervene. I knew this was beyond any attempt at mediation. Rachel, feeling the pressure of every pair of eyes on her, he tried to regain his composure. You have to understand that I was just following protocol, he said, his voice sounding more tense than he intended. Camille tilted her head with a slight smile. What protocol justifies treating the airline owners as if they do not belong here? Rachel felt her throat close up. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his tone firm and without a trace of doubt. When in Mr. Williams, Mrs. Williams, on behalf of the crew, I apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced. Jonathan nodded politely. I appreciate your professionalism, Captain. Rachel looked at the captain in disbelief. Was that all? A simple apology? Captain, she began to say, but Reynolds interrupted her in a colder tone than usual. Miss Carter, I'd like to speak to you privately. Now. Rachel felt her stomach plummet. I knew exactly what those words meant. Lisa, still standing by the Williams family seats, watched with a mixture of sorrow and resignation as Rachel walked stiffly to the back of the cabin alongside the captain. The door to the small resting area closed behind them. The silence inside the small space was stifling. Rachel tried to take a breath, but panic was beginning to set in her chest. Captain Reynolds looked at her with an impenetrable expression before crossing his arms. What were I thinking, Carter? Rachel felt the heat rise to her face. Captain, I didn't know who they were. Does that matter? He interrupted her, his voice lower, but with the same intensity. Since when do we judge passengers by how they look instead of the information on their tickets? Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but couldn't find the right words. The captain shook his head slowly. Not only has he made a serious mistake, but he has done so in the worst possible context, unjustifiably expelling the airline owners from their own company. Do you realize what this means? Rachel swallowed. His voice was barely a whisper. The captain sighed and ran a hand across his forehead. I'm going to file a report on this incident with management. Until then, I don't want you to interfere with this flight any further. Rachel felt her body tense. Are you removing me from my duties? I'm giving you the opportunity to not to make their situation even worse. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. Everything he had built, every effort to be flawless in his career, was crumbling in a matter of minutes. The captain gestured him toward the exit. You may return to your seat, but I don't want to see any more out-of-place actions. Rachel nodded slowly and walked out of the compartment with heavy steps. He felt the gazes on his back like needles. When he returned to the passenger cabin, his eyes met Camille's, who was still sitting with her unperturbed expression. There was no anger on his face, just a calculated patience. Rachel looked down and walked on. Captain Reynolds, after a few seconds of observation, turned to the Williams. If there is anything else we can do to remedy this situation, please let me know. Jonathan shook his head. For now, we just want the rest of the flight to pass in peace. The captain nodded. Camille, however, was not finished. Captain, he said in a casual tone. Yes, Mrs. Williams. Camille settled into her seat with natural elegance. I think there is something you could do for us. Tell me, Camille smiled gently. I would like you to consider the possibility of remove Miss Carter from this flight. A murmur ran through the cabin. It was a professional death sentence. Rachel, who had barely regained any stability, felt her legs turn to jelly. Captain Reynolds watched Camille for a second before nodding. I understand. Let me handle that immediately. Rachel felt her whole world crumble. The end was near, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin was thick, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Rachel stood, feeling every gaze on her like an unbearable weight. Never in her life had she been so exposed. Captain Reynolds turned to her with an impassive expression. Miss Carter, he said firmly, in consideration of the request of our most important passengers, and in light of your actions on this flight, I am asking you to gather your belongings and leave the aircraft. Rachel felt her body freeze. Are you kicking me off the flight? The captain nodded slowly. Yeah, and believe me, he's getting away with fewer consequences than he deserves. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. This was real. She pressed her lips together, feeling a wave of shame burn across her face. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for some sort of support. But there wasn't. Lisa, his cabin attendant, avoided his gaze, her face tense. There was nothing I could do to help her. The other passengers were also watching her, some with expressions of disapproval, others with a mixture of discomfort and curiosity. But the worst thing was seeing the look on her face. Edward Simmons, the tycoon who at the beginning of the flight seemed sure of his place in the world, was now completely mute, with a pale face and tight lips. Jonathan Williams glanced at him, and he gave a slight, humorless laugh. "Looks like karma works fast," he muttered. Simmons looked down, not daring to answer. Rachel felt her heart pounding uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening to him. "Captain, There is no further discussion, Miss Carter." Captain Reynolds cut him off in a definitive tone. "You may leave on your own, or I can request security assistance to escort you out." "Your decision." Rachel swallowed. There was no escape now. The murmurs among the passengers grew as she began to move with stiff steps toward the cabin exit. Every movement was a punishment, every look a sentence. When he passed by Camille Williams, the woman maintained the same serene expression as always. No trace of mockery, no anger, just observation. That made her feel even worse. Maya, the little girl, looked at her with big, curious eyes. Rachel couldn't hold her gaze. Finally, when he reached the door of the plane, he turned around for the last time, hoping to find some glimmer of support. Lisa, his faithful assistant, finally gave him one last look, but it was not solidarity. "I hope this helps you reflect, Rachel," he said quietly. Rachel felt a pang in her chest. Lisa had never called her by her first name before, without adding Miss Carter. It was his way of telling her that he no longer saw her as his superior. He took one last deep breath and walked through the door. Rachel's departure left a void in the cabin. There was a sense of justice in the air, but also a silent reminder of what had just happened. Captain Reynolds returned to the Williams family. "I am deeply sorry for everything that has happened," he said with genuine seriousness. "I assure you that this incident will be handled with the utmost care by the airline." Jonathan nodded. "Thank you, Captain." Camille, with her characteristic elegance, smiled at Lisa. "I really appreciate your professionalism." Lisa was taken aback for a second, but then tilted her head with a slight smile. "I just did what I thought was right, Mrs. Williams." The atmosphere in the cabin gradually changed. The tension began to dissipate, and the passengers were finally able to breathe normally. But for Edward Simmons, the story was not over yet. Jonathan turned to him slowly. "Anything you want to tell us, Mr. Simmons?" The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Camille smiled kindly. "Don't worry, sometimes silence is the best lesson." Simmons closed his mouth. There was nothing he could say that would make him come out on top. As the plane returned to its calm, Maya looked at her mother with wide eyes. "Mom, why did Miss Carter leave?" Camille stroked her hair tenderly. "Because he learned a lesson today, honey." Maya frowned. "Like the ones I learn at school." Jonathan smiled and looked at his daughter with pride. "Exactly, little one. Some lessons are difficult, but necessary." Maya nodded slowly. Lisa, watching the scene from her spot, she felt something change inside her. Rachel had been her mentor for years. She had learned a lot from her, but now she understood that blindly following someone was not always the right thing to do. He sighed and prepared to continue his work. The flight still had a long way ahead. The plane had stabilized on its course, but the energy in the first-class cabin was still charged with an invisible weight. Rachel Carter's absence was a void that everyone felt, although no one dared to mention it out loud. Lisa, standing by the airplane's galley, exhaled slowly before returning to her work. He had witnessed Rachel's rise and fall in a single flight. Meanwhile, Jonathan and Camille Williams, they remained in their seats, not saying much. It wasn't necessary. Everything they wanted to say had already been expressed in their actions. Lisa approached with a respectful gesture and, with a slight bow of her head, spoke in a calm voice. "Mr. and Mrs. Williams, on behalf of the entire crew, I would like to personally apologize for what happened." Jonathan looked up and nodded slowly. "We appreciate your words, Lisa. We know this doesn't reflect the entire Skylux crew." Lisa felt a slight wave of relief, but also a pang of shame. He had seen what was happening from the beginning and had not spoken before. Camille noticed his expression and gave him an understanding smile. "Sometimes it is not easy to see things clearly until the moment forces us to do so," he said softly. Lisa blinked, surprised by the tenderness in his tone. She nodded silently and retreated to continue her work. As the crew returned to normal, Edward Simmons remained slumped in his seat. His face was serious, his hands clenched on his knees. The difference between him and Rachel was that he was still on the flight, but the shame she felt was something she couldn't escape. Finally, after several minutes of awkward silence, Simmons cleared his throat and turned his head toward Jonathan. "Mr. Williams?" Jonathan looked at him, saying nothing. "I want to apologize," he said in a tense voice. "I was not professional." Camille, without changing her expression, slightly tilted her head. "No," he corrected softly. "It wasn't decent." Simmons swallowed and looked down. Jonathan studied him for a moment and then let out a soft sigh. "Have you ever wondered how many opportunities you've missed by judging people before you even meet them?" Simmons didn't immediately respond. He finally shook his head. "I never thought about it. Maybe it's time to do that," Jonathan said before turning to his wife, closing the subject without further ado. Simmons sank further into his seat, realizing the little I could do to repair what had happened. Maya, who had been silent until now, leaned towards her mother. "Mom, do you think Miss Carter will learn her lesson?" Camille stroked her hair tenderly. "That's up to her, honey. Learning is not just realizing a mistake, it is deciding to change." Maya pursed her lips in a thoughtful grimace. "What if it doesn't change?" Jonathan intervened with a slight smile. "Then the world will remind you of this again and again." Maya nodded, satisfied with the answer. Captain Reynolds passed by the cabin again. His expression was more relaxed, but he still carried the weight of what had happened. He stopped next to Jonathan and Camille. "I just want to reiterate that this incident will be reported and treated with the seriousness it deserves." Jonathan smiled politely. "We trust that will be the case, Captain." Camille tilted her head. "But there is something else you can do." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Tell me." "We want Skylux to establish clearer policies regarding discrimination and treatment of passengers." The captain was silent for a moment, then nodded firmly. "I will pass it on to the board." "Thank you," Camille said softly. The captain gave them one last bow before leaving. The tension that had enveloped the cabin since the beginning of the flight finally began to dissipate. Passengers went back to their activities. Some checked their emails, others settled down to sleep. But no one had forgotten what had just happened. Camille settled back into her seat and closed her eyes, enjoying a little peace for the first time during the entire flight. Jonathan took his wife's hand and squeezed it gently. "How do you feel?" Camille opened her eyes and looked at him tenderly. "Calm down," he said. Maya yawned and settled into her mother's lap. "Can we enjoy the trip now?" he murmured in a sleepy voice. Jonathan and Camille looked at each other and laughed softly. "Yes, little one," Camille said, kissing her forehead. "Now we can enjoy it." And for the first time in the entire flight, the atmosphere in the cabin felt really light. The plane moved smoothly over the Atlantic, gliding through the clouds with a tranquility that contrasted with the storm that had shaken the cabin hours before. For the family Williams, the air finally felt lighter. Camille, eyes closed, enjoyed the rare moment of peace. Jonathan watched the sky through the window, his mind processing everything that had happened. It was not the first time they had faced prejudice, but this time it had been different. This time, justice had come quickly. Maya, her head resting on her mother's lap, was breathing softly, already deep in sleep. Jonathan slid his hand over Camille's. "What are you thinking about?" Camille opened her eyes and looked at him with a calm smile. "On how much still needs to change." Jonathan nodded. "But today we took a step." Camille exhaled slowly. "Yes, and one that many saw." Jonathan looked at her carefully. "Do you think it will make a difference?" Camille smiled slyly. "Believe me, she will." In the crew rest area, Lisa was checking her phone. The news was already spreading. Someone, somewhere in the cabin, had discreetly recorded the argument between Rachel and the Williams family. The video was beginning to circulate on social media. Skylux Airways chief flight attendant faces consequences after discrimination incident with airline owners. Lisa exhaled slowly. "I knew this would go far." Rachel Carter hadn't just missed a flight. He had lost his reputation. Meanwhile, in New York, Rachel walked through the airport with her eyes downcast, feeling like each step was harder than the last. The return trip had been a torment. Hours ago, she was one of Skylux's most respected flight attendants. Now she was a name in the headlines. When he checked his phone, his stomach sank. His face was everywhere. Exclusive, unacceptable behavior by Skylux's chief stewardess. Discrimination in the air. The story behind the luxury airline scandal. The comments were no better. It's a good send-off. People like her don't deserve to be in customer service. Skylux should issue a public apology. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. The weight of her mistake finally caught up with her, and for the first time in a long time, he wondered when he had lost his way. Back on the plane, the Captain Reynolds made his last round of the cabin. He stopped next to the Williams family. "We're less than an hour away from landing. Everything okay?" Jonathan nodded with a slight smile. "Everything is perfect, Captain." Camille nodded too. "We appreciate your professionalism." Reynolds bowed his head respectfully. "I appreciate your words very much. And believe me, this will not be just a report." Camille smiled with satisfaction. "I hope not." Lisa, standing a few meters away, observed the scene with a mixture of admiration and determination. This flight had taught him more than any training, and there was something I had to do. When the plane finally landed in London, the disembarkation protocol began as normal. However, as the Williamses headed for the exit, Lisa caught up with them. "Mrs. Williams," he called, a note of urgency in his voice. Camille turned around curiously. Lisa cleared her throat, a gleam of determination in her eyes. "I wanted to thank you." Camille watched her silently for a moment before tilting her head slightly. "Because?" Lisa took a breath. "Because they helped me see that silence is not neutral. It's a choice." Jonathan smiled approvingly. "I'm glad to know that you understood." Lisa nodded determinedly. "I'm going to make sure this flight isn't just a sideshow. I'm going to talk to the company about inclusion policies." Camille gave him a genuine smile. "That's the real change, Lisa. Not just learning, but act." Lisa smiled back and nodded goodbye. As the Williams family walked across the walkway, Maya slowly woke up and looked at her mother. "Are we there yet?" Camille kissed her forehead. "Yes, honey. We're here." Jonathan looked at the illuminated airport in front of them and took his wife's hand. "An unforgettable trip," Camille smiled. "A necessary one." With their heads held high, they exited the aircraft, and the world, without knowing it, had just changed a little bit more. The news of the incident on the flight Skylux Airways spread like wildfire on social media. The headlines left no room for doubt. Chief flight attendant fired after in-flight discrimination. Skylux Airways owners face prejudice at 35,000 feet. How far does unconscious bias go? A story that forces us to reflect. The video of the altercation went viral, sparking a global conversation. Some defended Rachel, saying she didn't mean anything maliciously. Others argued that the problem was deeper. Skylux Airways issued an official statement days later, announcing new inclusion policies and mandatory training for all staff. They also confirmed the permanent dismissal of Rachel Carter and an internal review of its protocols. Meanwhile, Rachel disappeared from the public eye. Would he learn from the lesson? Lisa, for her part, became one of the most active voices within the company, driving real change from within. But the real question remained hanging in the air. How many times does this happen without anyone noticing? How many times does prejudice hide behind courtesy? The Williams family's trip wasn't just a flight. It was a reminder that equality is still a struggle. And now it's up to you to reflect. Have you witnessed a similar situation? What would you do in Lisa's place? How can we make the world a more just place? Leave us your opinion and share this story, because the change starts with a conversation.